To better understand how our bodies function, we need to understand how we convert sugars into energy. Our cells do this through a process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process by which all living things take the energy stored in food and convert it to energy that can be used. Like photosynthesis, it's a complicated process. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are probably the two most difficult things we cover in this class. If you look at the inputs and outputs of cellular respiration, you may notice that in some ways it's a reverse of photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plants used water and carbon dioxide, plus some energy, to create sugars. They then released some oxygen as a byproduct. In cellular respiration, cells are using sugar and oxygen to generate ATP, and they give off carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. This is happening in cells throughout your body. As food is digested in the digestive system, those nutrients get passed to the circulatory system, which delivers them to cells. Those cells then need to undergo cellular respiration to release the energy stored in those nutrients and convert it to ATP, which they can use to do work. So again, we need two basic things for cellular respiration: oxygen and sugar. This is why we need a steady supply of oxygen to our bodies, and why we feel tired if our sugar levels are low. After cellular respiration is complete, we have converted the energy in the food to ATP, which is in a form the cells can use. We also have two byproducts produced: carbon dioxide and water. This is where the carbon dioxide we exhale comes from. If you haven't already, open up participation assignment 13 and answer these questions. Cellular respiration has 3 steps. We'll go through each of these in detail. The first step has 2 parts. First, we have glycolysis, where glucose, or sugar, is broken down into pyruvate molecules. This happens in the cytosol of the cell. If you remember, the cytosol is the fluid inside the cell. So glycolysis is happening in the cytosol of cells throughout your body. You can remember what's happening in this step by understanding what the word glycolysis means. Lysis means splitting, and glycol means sugar. So you can think of glycolysis as the splitting of sugar molecules. Again, it's the breakdown of glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules, and we produce a little bit of ATP doing so. Glycolysis occurs in 2 phases. First is the preparatory phase. Of course, we are ultimately trying to make ATP, but to break down these sugars, we also have to use a little bit of ATP. Some energy from ATP is used to destabilize the glucose so it can be broken down. Then we have the payoff phase of glycolysis. That destabilized glucose is broken into 2 pyruvate molecules, and we produce more ATP than we used to break that glucose apart. We also produce a couple other things. Remember that water is one of the byproducts of cellular respiration. When glucose is broken into pyruvates, we also produce and release some water. We also produce a molecule called NADH. But we're not done with the first step yet. We still have to produce a molecule called acetylcholine A. The pyruvates produced in glycolysis move to the mitochondria of the cell. Remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where most of the ATP is being produced to power cellular work. So it makes sense that we need to migrate over to the mitochondria to continue this process. In the mitochondria, the pyruvates are broken down and combined with an enzyme to produce acetylcholine A. During this process, some carbon dioxide is also produced and released as a byproduct. Now pause and answer these two questions. Now that we've produced acetylcholine A, we're ready to move on to the citric acid cycle. Here we will produce more ATP and some molecules called high-energy electron carriers. Again, we're still in the mitochondria. Remember, this is where cells produce most of their energy. We produced a little bit during glycolysis, but we're going to keep producing ATP in the citric acid cycle. So we take that acetylcholine A that we produced in the first stage of cellular respiration and use it to make molecules called high-energy electron transporters. These are molecules that carry electrons. Electrons, again, are negatively charged particles that can carry a lot of energy. The citric acid cycle is just that, a cycle. So as acetylcholine A is being produced by glycolysis, this cycle is continuously repeating. You don't have to worry about all the steps of this process. But what's happening here is that acetylcholine A is being used in a series of chemical reactions to produce those high-energy electron transporters, NADH and FADH2. During this process, we also produce some ATP, but we're not at the big ATP payload yet. Pause the video again and answer these two questions. The electron transporters we just produced now enter the electron transport chain. This is similar to the electron transport chain we saw in photosynthesis. Here, the energy from the high-energy electron transporters is used to pump protons across the mitochondria's membrane. As this happens, it creates a concentration gradient. That concentration gradient is a form of potential energy that we can use to generate ATP, just like the concentration gradient produced in photosynthesis. To talk about what's happening in the electron transport chain, we need to know a little bit about the structure of the mitochondria. The mitochondria has a double membrane. The citric acid cycle takes place inside the inner membrane. In the electron transport chain, we're going to pump protons into the space between the two membranes, again creating a concentration gradient. So let's look at this process. In the first phase, we use those high-energy electron transporters to pass electrons from molecule to molecule. Each time electrons are passed, a little energy is released. That energy is used to pump protons from inside the mitochondria to the space between the membranes, creating a concentration gradient. So now that concentration gradient is a store of potential energy between the two membranes of the mitochondria. Those protons want to get away from each other and move back across the membrane. So as they rush back inside the inner membrane, the potential energy is converted to kinetic energy. This kinetic energy is used to convert ADP to ATP. Now pause and answer these questions. Remember that energy is stored in the bonds of ATP. So what's actually happening here is a phosphate group is being added to ADP, converting it to ATP. Now there is energy stored in that bond in ATP. So we produced a little ATP at each step in cellular respiration. But the electron transport chain is where most of that ATP is produced. In glycolysis, we produced 2 ATP molecules. We produced 2 more in the citric acid cycle, but we produced 32 molecules of ATP in the electron transport chain. Now the energy stored in those sugar molecules is in the form of ATP, which can be used by cells. Again, like photosynthesis, cellular respiration is a complicated process. You may need to listen through this lecture and think through the process several times to understand what's going on. Sometimes drawing yourself a flowchart or making flashcards for each step can be a good way to learn this.